Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's terrific to be back with you. It is November 15th, finally feeling like fall here in New York City. As I peer out into Midtown, it is a little bit overcast, and it's time to start wearing overcoats. And it's also time to begin thinking about Thanksgiving, and otherwise the city has a buzz in that respect, as there really is a sense that we're inching into the holiday season. And with that in mind, glad that all of you could take the time to be with us. We're really delighted, as always, to bring you updates on what's new and topical in the law and otherwise that as our clients and friends, we want to ensure that you know. And so if you could go to the next slide, please, Kathy, I'll walk everyone through today's agenda. And so I'll be beginning with some updates on the elections, which of course were significant on the national as well as New York State stages. I mentioned when I was on with you 2 weeks ago that I would be summarizing them, and now we know much more, so stand by for that. And then we'll have Michael Cradaville, who is an attorney trainee under supervision, but someone who has joined our firm and has good knowledge in this area concerning the NLRB and its current approach toward penalties for unfair labor practices. Michael will be speaking to that. I should note that, again, he is under supervision both by attorney Sam Dobre, who's not with us today, but who has presented before all of you before, and as well me. So questions that do come up during the course of Michael's presentation, Sam or I will address in oversight of Michael. Julia O'Sullivan will be speaking about the EPA and its finalization of its environmental justice plan. This is big news, particularly for those of us who are watching closely how the effects of climate change and otherwise the connected policies are coming into place at federal and other jurisdictional levels. So this is an important gaze into what this environmental justice plan looks like. So Julia, thank you for joining us. Then I'll come back and provide updates both on COVID and other public health type issues, as well as on the healthcare worker bonus program, which I've spoken with to all of you, about before. And we'll make sure to leave time for your questions and remarks as always, and looking forward to hearing from you as this program progresses, because we want to be sure we can answer anything that comes up as best possible. So with that, why don't we move to the elections, please? And Kathy, next slide would be terrific. And the next slide after this depiction of our two major parties. Here we are to talk about the national picture. It was, in many respects, an historically strong midterm election for a sitting Democratic president. It has been the general pattern going back generations that following the first 2 years of a president's term, there is usually a very significant amount of loss in the legislative cycle that follows. That wasn't the case this year, though there are still some results pending. In the Senate, with a very narrow majority, it is clear that the Senate will remain Democratic, and Senator Schumer will remain in his leadership role as the majority leader. And then what we also, though, note is that in the House, although the House has shifted, and some of that is still getting worked out because there's some races that are very close and still getting counted, there is going to be a change in leadership. It will no longer be Speaker Pelosi. It may end up being Speaker McCarthy. We shall see. It's still up for discussion. But there is very much a sense that relative to the kinds of losses that normally the party and leadership sustains 2 years out, we didn't see that this time. There is some sense among political pundits, and I don't pretend to be one, just sharing what I've learned, that some of this is in essence a response to the candidates that former President Trump was backing, in a sense, among the electorate, that there was a discomfort in bringing many of them into office. And so we are seeing that reflected across the country. And certainly, though, by the time I come back in 2 weeks, we should know more in formal fashion in terms of what the federal picture looks like. And we can go to the next slide to discuss what else we've since learned. And this is now turning to New York, where we have a governor elected to a full term. Governor Hochul is the first woman to lead New York State and to win an election outright. Of course, all of you are familiar with the circumstances that led to Governor Hochul assuming office following the change and the resignation of Governor Andrew Cuomo. This is the first time that Governor Hochul has herself secured the governor's office through the electoral process. And it is important to note, though, that the race was far closer than many had predicted. Reasons are complicated, and we'll get into some of that. But what is definitely the case, and very much conveyed across national conversations about the same, is that Lee Zeldin, who's a representative, of course, at the federal level, ran very competitively across all of New York State. And the race was so close that we had visits in New York State from President Biden, former President Clinton also stumped, as it were, on behalf of Governor Hochul. It became a very focal geography for the national picture in New York. And that was reflective of the kinds of tight margins that we saw in the governor's race ultimately. What's next for Representative Zeldin is not certain, though certainly there is clear resonance with some of his messages around enhanced public safety and the questions around the expansiveness of government, to be clear as to what that bullet point means down there. Essentially, the governor ran on a platform that was distinct in many respects from Representative Zeldin's, and in the end, it was Governor Hochul's race that she won narrowly. Let's go to the next slide, please. Across New York State, I was alluding to some of that down ballot activity. There was an unexpected number of victories for Republicans. I've described it as a relative red wave because in New York State, we still have a larger number of seats that are held by Democrats, but it's much closer than it was expected to be, in part because there were some really significant holds, one of them being Nicole Malliotakis, who represents Brooklyn and Staten Island and has been very vocal and connected to former President Trump. She defeated her opponent very handily. It was a rematch of the election 2 years ago. And as you can see, she had more than 62% of victory margin relative to Max Rose. And so other major unexpected results I'll turn to in a moment. If Kathy, you go to the next slide, please, I can walk everyone through that. The first being Sean Patrick Maloney, who is the Democratic National Committee chair. He lost in a race against Mike Lawler in the Mid-Hudson. That is a major change for the leadership of the Democratic Party. And for that to happen, essentially on the home turf, it is not so different than the changes that we saw a couple years ago, leading to changes in power in the 2020 elections as well as the 2018 elections. It is seismic in that nature. And so we also saw that Marcus Molinaro, who had run for the governorship against former Governor Cuomo, also secured a House seat, and Claudia Tenney also performed very well, as you might have noticed on the slide that preceded this. So all of this is to say, there are lots of people looking back and wondering, so what happened? And I can walk through some of that on the next slide, please, if Kathy, you would please advance to it. You see there are a number of factors that are worth discussing here. Questions around essentially the broader down ballot, as it's called, strategy below Governor Hochul. There's a sense that although reproductive rights are very much a topic of national conversation, and Governor Hochul really positioned much of her campaign and its focus around that issue, among others. It wasn't necessarily, at least by exit polling and others, viewed as resonant as issues around public safety, which really captured the attention of many New Yorkers voting. There are also, in the context of this, calls for Jay Jacobs, who leads the state Democratic Party, to step down. Several key lawmakers have pointed to that as an appropriate recourse given what has transpired, although Governor Hochul has voiced support for Jacobs, at least to this point. If you trace this all back, you can look to the 2020 census as a key marker of how things began to get relatively unsteady for the Democrats in the state. Of course, you all may remember that when that tally was finally counted up and across the state, the country, the 435 seats were reallocated among those in the House. There was a decrement of 1 seat in New York, which led to a cascade of various effects, including an effort to redistrict. And in that redistricting, the original map that the Democrats presented was deemed to have been unconstitutional. And then there was a new map ultimately agreed to, and there was involvement of special masters and other elements that essentially oversaw that process during the summer, which we've spoken here about before. And it led to some unexpected shuffling and shifting across the state. For instance, Representative Munder Jones ran down in the New York City area for the seat that ultimately Dan Goldman has secured through the general election. Jones, of course, lost the primary and is now going to be on his way out of Congress. We also know that Sean Maloney did not secure that seat that essentially Jones had ceded. And so that was an unexpected outcome. And we also see that Democrats lost key leadership, with Carolyn Maloney losing in that primary she had against Jerry Nadler. That is another way in which the mapping had very measurable effects that we're seeing as we look back on what happened. But there'll still be more to be discussing here, but it's really interesting and atypical that New York has seen such a shift, and further that the shift is of such a pronounced nature that's really affecting the national House picture. Let's go to the next slide, please. And that brings us to our next speaker, who is Michael. And so Michael is, as I noted, being overseen by Sam and me for the purposes of this presentation today. He was a summer law clerk with Bonn, received his undergraduate degree from Boston College, and he also studied at Brooklyn Law School, where he received his JD. We're thrilled that Michael recently passed the bar, and he's working down the hall from me in the New York City office. And we look forward to hearing from Michael more as he continues to step into his role here at Bonn. But today, Michael, thank you for joining us to talk about the NLRB and the change in its approach to penalties for unfair labor practices. Michael, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, Gabe. So the article that I worked on with fellow associate Sam Dobre focuses on remedies under the National Labor Relations Act, which for any statute is extremely significant. They most directly affect recovery under a statute, but this then would affect the level of investment in litigating potential infringements or preventing infringements. So in other words, the greater the potential liability is, the more that needs to be done to limit that liability. We can go to the next slide now. So under the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRB has traditionally permitted remedies only in the form of, as you can see, reinstatement, back pay, injunctions, or the posting of board notices, which highlight the unfair labor practice. However, in a September 2021 memorandum, NLRB General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo encouraged the various board regions to explore more costly penalties for unfair labor practices in a number of different contexts. So GC Abruzzo held that the power to bolster remedies was derived from the broad language of Section 10C of the National Labor Relations Act. This section gives the board the power to take such affirmative action, which would refer to remedies, as will effectuate the policies of the act. And the board used this language in June 2022 to issue a consequential damages award for the first time ever. So we can go to the next slide. So consequential damages function as a make-whole remedy that attempt to restore individuals to the position that they would be in before the harm was done. And so in the context of labor relations, consequential damages would seek to make employees and employers whole for economic losses suffered as a direct and foreseeable result of an unfair labor practice. And so an award of this type would go well beyond back pay that already exists as a remedy under the Act, permitting financial recovery for losses that were caused by the unfair labor practice. And so as mentioned previously, the board issued a consequential damages award in June 2022 against the United Mine Workers of America, which is a North American labor union that had been alleged to have committed strike-related unfair labor practices. So the original damages award was at $13 million, but this was reduced to under $500,000 in late September 2022, which makes it more relevant now. However, most notably, the award was not reversed and neither party challenged the use of consequential damages as a remedy for unfair labor practices. And so both employees and employers appear to now be equipped with a new make-whole remedy that will raise the stakes of labor relations by substantially disincentivizing unfair labor practices. We can go to the next slide then. So in the 2021 memo, GC Abruzzo also advocated for changes in remedies in a number of different areas, as you can see on the screen, including discrimination cases, cases involving undocumented workers, union organizing drives, failures to bargain, and postings of board notices. So starting with discrimination cases, the board again has make-whole aims in mind as it seeks to allow consequential damages in these cases, as well as front pay on top of back pay. So to clarify the difference between front pay and back pay is essentially money awarded for lost compensation that occurs between the time of the judgment and reinstatement, while back pay is compensation for money and benefits owed for a period in which the employee could have been working but was unlawfully prevented from doing so, which in this context would be for, discrimination that would infringe upon the National Labor Relations Act. So then moving on to charges involving undocumented workers, GC Abruzzo urged the various board regional offices to seek remedies that would prevent employers from being unjustly enriched by unlawful treatment of undocumented workers. So some of these remedies that were mentioned in the memo include compensation for work performed under unlawfully imposed terms or conditions of employment, and employer sponsoring of work authorizations for these undocumented workers. Next, looking at union organizing drives, the board has long sought to ensure free and fair elections through various case law, but now General Counsel Abruzzo is looking to do even more to disincentivize employers' influence in elections by articulating a list of new proposed remedies for these contexts. So these include increased union access to employees, reimbursement of organizing costs, increasing the length and reach of posted notices, increased board monitoring of employer activity to ensure compliance with orders, required training of employees on their rights under the National Labor Relations Act, and broader cease and desist orders. The board has also been committed to encouraging collective bargaining between employers and unions, but General Counsel Abruzzo again seeks to bolster penalties in this area through a list of proposed remedies. These include board required bargaining schedules, submission of progress reports on the status of bargaining, reinstatement of prior bargaining proposals, reimbursement of collective bargaining expenses, extensions of a union's certification period, which is essentially how long a union maintains its status as the exclusive bargaining representative of the relevant bargaining unit of employees, and then broader cease and desist orders. Lastly, focusing on board notices, which were mentioned earlier in the presentation as one of the already existing remedies that the board will use. The remedy itself currently includes a posting of a notice issued by the board at the employer's place of business, articulating the unfair labor practice that the employer committed. This actually occurs then after a case has been litigated before the board and the employer was found to have violated the act. And so as has been the theme of the prior proposed changes and remedies, GC Abruzzo seeks to bolster this already existing remedy in order to spread notoriety beyond the confines of the business. The proposed changes from the memo that are most notable include distribution of notices through text messages and then through postings on social media. And the latter of these could have really large implications for public scrutiny of businesses and for educating workers on their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. So employers really need to remain on notice for this proposed change, especially, and then for the others under the board memo, all of which have the potential to raise the stakes of labor relations to a new, really costly level. So that completes my presentation. I'll hand it back over to Gabe now.
Michael, thank you so much. Really glad that you could be with us and to take the time to walk through that material. There's a lot that we all can continue to learn here, and we look forward to having you back. Glad that you took the time to meet this group for the first time. And with that, I will move on to our next speaker. And that is, of course, Julia O'Sullivan. And Julia, just for your background, comes to us from the Buffalo office, and she's a graduate both of the University of Buffalo Law School and Clarkson University. In terms of where she focuses her professional energies as an attorney, she assists clients in assessing environmental projects, including reviewing and preparing materials for brownfield cleanup program applications, among other types of activities in that space. And she's also very involved in being supportive around development of correspondence and pleadings and litigation materials in the vein of environmental law more broadly. And so we're really glad that Julia can take the time to speak with us today, and in specific to cover this environmental justice action plan that I alluded to in my introductory remarks. Julia, I'm hopeful that we'll all learn from what you have to share, and I look forward to listening. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. If you could advance the next slide. So in September of this year, the EPA released its draft Environmental Justice Action Plan. And the two things that really spurred this were the two executive orders issued in January 2021 and in March 2021. The first order in January 2021 set the policy of the federal government to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity throughout all of its programs and the offices that it runs. This policy was furthered in March 2021 when the federal agencies were directed through another executive order to incorporate this policy into their mission. And it offered some guidance on how to do that. The initial draft of the Environmental Justice Action Plan was issued about a year later in January 2022. And then after public input, public engagement sessions, and also a couple drafts, a final draft was issued in September 2022, which is what I've chosen to present on. So if you could advance the slide, please. So the executive orders lay out a couple of tasks for the agencies involved. One of the tasks is to close the gap. It's obvious that there's disparities based on race in various places like wages and housing. So the agencies were tasked with closing that gap. So in their programs, focusing on what is causing these gaps and then doing things to change those. The next was making sure that they had input from their target audience, which are the historically underserved communities. Both the EPA and I'm in New York, so the DEC have some form of an environmental justice map on their online systems, which helps not only the federal governments, but the private sector to incorporate this target audience into their development plans. Another thing was to find resources for all these programs. Most federal agencies offer some sort of grant program, such the EPA offers multiple grant programs. So the director of the Office of Management and Budget was tasked with figuring out where to pull some of these resources so that the people who are looking to implement these plans have the funding to do so. And then the last task, which one of many, but the last that I covered was the agencies were really tasked with going into these communities and figuring out how to help them. Next slide, please. So some of these components. The first one is the compliance network. Everyone's aware that there's already an existing network of compliance, whether it's through RCRA or the Superfund sites. A lot of things are touched by environmental justice areas. So the executive orders laid out a framework to strengthen compliance with these environmental statutes and in turn increase communication between different agencies. Unfortunately, sometimes you're working with an agency and they're not always the best group to do what you need them to do. So the executive orders lay out a way, and then in turn the plan laid out a way for some of these agencies to work together. So say you give something to your environmental consultant or the environmental agency you're working with, but it's not usually their forte, they can direct it to other agencies to deal with certain things. And then so another thing that they worked on was finalizing a clean air risk management plan, which has been in the works in the past, but it hasn't fully been executed. So I think that goes to incorporating the environmental justice into certain things and helping those overburdened communities. Next slide. So there are a lot of potential benefits. Funding is a key one, especially for developers in various areas. The March 2021 executive order mandates that at least 40% of the benefits of certain federal programs go to certain environmental justice impacted communities. So this will give these disadvantaged communities more resources to be able to not only change their situation, but also figure out what's causing the situation and all of that. And then the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery is tasked with helping this, as well as all the other programs that are being implemented throughout the federal government. Next slide, please. So future impacts. It's clear that it's unclear. Unfortunately, it's clear that the executive orders give jobs to the various federal agencies to incorporate this into their policies, but to the extent of what is going to require, such as additional regulations, additional applications. For example, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation recently redid their brownfield application, and not only it increased by about 5 pages, and one of those questions that it increased or added was related to environmental justice. So we're going to be seeing this environmental justice question pop up not only on the federal specter, but also on the state specter. But in turn, it's also clear that there will be lots more grant opportunities because of this environmental justice action plan. So it'll definitely be a good opportunity for businesses to take advantage of these grants. And that concludes my presentation. So I'm going to send it back to Gabe.
Well, thank you so much, Julia, for taking the excuse me, the time to come to the webinar and to walk this group through what the evolving notions of environmental justice really look like. And you alluded to the fact that applications are expanding, and that obviously has an impact on our clients who are turning to us for guidance as they navigate those kinds of materials as they pursue projects and the like. So please trust that for those listening, Julia and the rest of the team, is familiar with these kinds of changes, thinking about them both from the policy perspective as well as from the operational lens. And so, Julia, thank you for providing these insights, and you're always welcome back. So with that, I'll turn back to the next element that I was going to cover, which is really a set of 2 different subjects. First being where we are with COVID and other elements of public health. And then I'll turn to the healthcare worker bonus, which is something that we've spoken about here a number of times before, and I'll give you what we have in terms of updates there. So the next slide, please, Kathy, would be great. So it's important to note that the public health emergency looks to be ongoing. There is this 60-day clock that we've mentioned before, where the Secretary of HHS essentially pledged that if the PHE were to end, it would be communicated with 60 days of notice. The most recent 60-day period before the end of the current iteration lapsed on the 11th of last week. And so everyone is assuming that not only will the PHE run into January, but then there'll be another 90 days that take us into mid-April. This has been the process that has been underway since 2020, where there have been these 90-day extensions. And the reason why, as best we can tell from what people have been talking about out there, it's an expectation, if not anticipation, of the various challenges that come when we all move more indoors. As I mentioned at the top of this program, it's getting chillier here, certainly in New York City, and that means more of our conduct will be indoors, not just here, but across the country, and that may have an effect on how COVID and other respiratory illnesses spread. An interesting note during the so-called lame duck session, as we move between now and the introduction of that new term of Congress, there is a push by the Biden administration to see about $10 billion approved for COVID-19 funding. And this comes in the context of broader approvals that the administration is seeking, for instance, in support of Ukraine in its ongoing war. And all of that is certainly going to be part of what we will be discussing in the political environment for the coming weeks between now and when Congress next convenes in 23 with new representatives and as well new leadership, as I mentioned earlier. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? I think it's also important that we just take a minute to look at where COVID stands nationally. I haven't had a chance to walk this through with you recently, and it's important periodically that we check in with you as an audience on what we're seeing and what's being reported. There's a slight uptick nationally with about a 4% change over the last 14 days and today. This represents, though, as you look at the bar graph, a general flattening out that we've seen since some of the highest peaks during the summer when Omicron was buzzing about. And what happens during the fall and into winter is still very much an open question, but that's where things stand nationally for the moment. If Kathy, please advance, let's talk about what we're seeing from a pictorial presentation. The last time I brought up this map was when I was with you on September 20th, and you'll see there are hotspots on the left side of the slide, if you will, arrayed by and large in the center of the country, but also in the Mid-South. What we're seeing now is generally a concentration in the Southwest as well as in the Dakotas, a bit of an uptick in upstate New York as well, near Vermont. So we'll be tracking all of that. But as you can see, grossly, there are fewer hotspots across the country than what we saw just a couple months ago. And all of this is based on the data, of course, that I've mentioned more than once are imperfect, in part because there's so much home testing going on and not everything is captured in the way it was in the early days of the pandemic. There's also lesser reliance on PCR testing, all these things, but this is at least what we have to share in terms of nationally circulating data. Next slide, please. And if you look at the picture in New York State, again, there was that huge spike earlier in this year, but if you really think about when we had the greatest spikes, they were all very much behind us temporally. And it's still unclear what we're going to be seeing as we move into the winter. It is definitely the case that the Omicron booster uptake is lagging. It's been available, including available to children, but reports are that there are still relatively few people who have availed themselves of it relative to the opportunities. And it's happening at the same time that we're seeing the circulation of an early flu, a seasonal flu that is typical, but it's come early this year. And there's also RSV circulating, which is affecting children and older adults. So there's stress on the healthcare system right now, even though in terms of COVID, there is generally some stability if you look at the broader New York State picture. Next slide, please. And if you want to take a look at where things are across New York State, again 2 months ago versus now, and this is roughly September 20th to the 15th to be more specific, we are seeing generally drops in the kinds of concentration that we saw overall. If you look, for instance, in New York City, it was nearly 4,600 daily average cases back then, and now we're at 4,200 and change. So, excuse me, I meant to say New York State, forgive me. And so that represents a significant difference in terms of where we were versus where we are in terms of what we're capturing with our data. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with that, what I'll do is take the balance of this time to walk you through the healthcare worker bonus, knowing that, of course, we will continue to track COVID and other public health relating data and keep you all apprised in terms of what you should know. I'm also familiar, of course, with the fact that Adam was with you last week and walked through some of the ongoing implications in terms of state policy around essentially with what we know about COVID, what are we doing with sick leave and the rest. And we will continue to be with you to update you on those issues. But for today, what I'm going to do with the balance of our time is talk about the healthcare worker bonus, which is a program that has merited the attention of this group throughout the summer months, and there continue to be iterations that we think are important for you to know about. Most significantly, to begin, what I can tell you is we have from the state, going back to Halloween, October 31st, a notice that went out that essentially extended the reporting deadline for vesting period number 2 for those employers that are obligated to enter data from the 31st to November 30th. And if you look at the verbiage that I pulled from the DOH website, the healthcare worker bonus website that many of you know have perused, and otherwise that we've helped you navigate offline. And by the way, still reach out to me or any of the attorneys that you've engaged on these issues, because they are knotty and sometimes worth further conversation. What is clear is that even if the deadline officially has moved to November 30th for the uploading of data, what didn't change is the statute that set out the vesting period dates, and that goes back to the budget from where this program emanated. And so it's essentially an obligation of employers to continue to really carefully document what you're doing in this program. For instance, if you've been unable to get data up into the portal, which many of you have reported here, or to us, I should say, and that we've shared with all of you as something that has been certainly a statewide phenomenon, continue to track carefully what you're doing to try to get data in the right place. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just as a reminder for all of you to set the stage, it's just important to remember that there are $1.2 billion here at stake, and this comes from the budget back in April that the governor oversaw her first budget, and it was concerning recruiting, retraining, and rewarding healthcare and mental hygiene workers. And so, with all of that in mind, we have been for these last months figuring out, well, how do we get the money, as it were, into the hands of those employees for whom it is intended? And it has not been, in all respects, easy, given some of the administrative and operational hurdles that we have focused on here. Let's go to the next slide, please. And as a reminder, bonus amounts are essentially at different levels of 500 through 1,500 per vesting period. And there is a maximum of $3,000 that any one employee can receive from an employer. So let's go to the next slide, please, with that level setting in mind. What we have seen is that the Department of Health continues to update its FAQs, most recently did so on November 4th. We also know that a lot of the updates that were focused on educational providers as of mid-October continue to be where much of the attention is placed by the department. And so we encourage all of you who are educational providers or otherwise employers who did not take part in this program until October, because the instructions have been essentially to wait, to make sure you're reading those FAQs closely, because things are changing, and candidly, some of the guidance itself has moved from one position to another as the state has considered additional data. So these FAQs are really important, is the point, in terms of making sure that in terms of who's qualified as employees and how to handle various tax implications, et cetera, that you're following the roadmap that the state has presented here. So let's go to the next slide, please, Kathy. In that vein of, we now have an extension until November 30th. It's important for all of you, please, to let us know what you're hearing and what you're experiencing. We've heard from many of you to this point that it has become both laborious, if not impossible, to upload data because of the various pathways that exist to get to the portal. They've just not been working. The IDs have not been matching. Educational providers weren't in the system in ways they expected. Healthcare providers weren't. We've heard various iterations of that theme. It is the sense of the governor's office, the second floor, as has been essentially communicated through certain channels, that the governor's office is of the general belief that things are now pretty much up and running, and that employers should be in position to get things where they need to. We're not candidly certain that's the case, and we are very interested in hearing from you if you are continuing to have problems, because it is very important that we help you and advocate for you, as well give you the tools to navigate these kinds of challenges. But also we want to be able to help working in concert with trade associations and the like to highlight the fact that no, there still are issues open if they indeed remain as such. And so this is really the window before we get into the Thanksgiving holiday, before we get too close to November 30th. And arguably, it's the last time over the course of this program that we'll really have this kind of attention of the second floor to try to work out the proverbial kinks in the program. So we ask you just to please make sure you let us know what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. It doesn't need to be me personally. There are plenty of other bond attorneys, as I've mentioned, both who were presented here, as well with whom you might have connected offline. And just please do communicate with us around this program so that we can make sure information is getting to the right places and to help you, of course, stay in compliance. And then please save the date, particularly for those who are in the education space. Seth Gilbertson, who's presented here before on numerous topics, and I will be presenting on more technical aspects relating to institutes of higher education. This will be a second presentation we'll be delivering through the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities. We've penciled in tentatively November 21st of 22 at 1 p.m. That is still, again, in pencil, not in ink. So we'll certainly keep you all updated on when that date is set, and as will for those of you who are members of that trade association. I'm confident you'll hear from them as well. And let me just reiterate, we are here to help. So we're hopeful this is not the last time we hear from you on this topic. There have been a number of questions that have come in through the chat. And so, I'm looking at them. Some of them are very specific to organizations and their questions around how they should approach the bonus, whether on tax and whether particular titles are appropriate. Because this is a general program where we're providing guidance to a broad audience, what I'm going to do is I'll personally reach out to those who have posed a set of questions here and handle them, as it were, offline with you on an individual basis so that we can help your organizations with pinpointed guidance. And so just please trust that you will be hearing from us. And I look forward to, as always, being back here as a host. My next program that I'm scheduled to lead is on November 29th, which will be after Thanksgiving. So we know that all of you have, with any luck, much to celebrate in your lives and in your families with your loved ones. So please make the most of that holiday. And I look forward to being here again on the 29th, both to give you further understanding of where we are in our national electoral picture, as well as to make sure that you're hearing from my fellow bond attorneys on those topics that really make a difference in the way you conduct your business operations. And so thank you for tuning in, as you always do. We appreciate your loyalty, and you can reach out to any of us who presented by way of the email addresses you see here, or otherwise, please contact the bond attorney that you have the best and most regular working relationship with. And for now, please stay safe out there, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Have a good day.